Friends, I want to tell you about Revoice Conference this summer. And yes, if we haven't met yet, maybe we're not quite friends yet, but I assume if you come to Revoice, then we will meet, and then we can be friends. I have had the joy of being at every Revoice conference, so this is an easy plug for me to invite you into. If you haven't been, or if you've been before, come out to Seattle early July 9th through 12th, and join for a few days of just lovely time together, worship, listening to great speakers, going out to different breakout workshops on not just fascinating, but just, important topics that become really practical, whether you yourself are just trying to figure out how do I live a flourishing life with God in the midst of my sexuality, or you want to know how can I be a good friend, a good partner in a church and support the queer SSA community. We have a really terrific lineup of speakers. Dr. Wesley Hill is returning, arts speaking. Our friend Mwendia, who we've interviewed before, is also coming across the ocean to join us. Julia Sadusky, who I would love to get on our podcast at some point. And I'm really excited. If you haven't registered, check out the link in the show notes and do what you can to make it out there. Bring a friend with you, or if you really can't come there physically, there are some online registration options as well. I know people have appreciated, and they're looking to make those engaging. In fact, Elaine and I will be doing a panel on the stage that will be live streamed around community living, and TJ will be doing a not live streamed panel on Kinship 101. How to actually think about all the different ways that we build kinship. So Lord willing, it'd be great to see you there. Hello and welcome to another episode of New Kinship, one that I'm particularly excited about. My name is David Frank and I'm co-hosting with TJ.
Hi, everyone.
And we have two guests today, Kaz and Aogu. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yeah. So what's really fun, well, I'll give, both of you a little bit of introductions. And so we're interviewing Kaz and Aogu about their work in specifically writing on the conversation of faith and sexuality for Japanese Christians, translating works into Japanese. And I think it's just really fun we've been trying to have conversations on New Kinship that exit just the American context that I'm most familiar with. And so we've had folks from Africa, and this is exciting to be able to, go across the ocean even further. So our first guest is Aogu Fujihashi, a gay or same-sex attracted Japanese Christian man. He's been involved with YWAM since the 2011 tsunami relief efforts and staffed with them for the last 5 years. For the last 3 years or so, he has focused more and more on working to help equip and resource the Japanese church to have healthier conversations about faith and sexuality. Last year, Aogu had the honor of helping edit the Japanese translation of Two Views on Homosexuality, the Bible, and the Church, which was just released early April. He is passionate about creating spaces where people who previously thought God didn't love them can experience his love and consequently live lives that are whole and full of worship. Thank you so much for joining us, Aogu.
Thanks so much for having us.
Our second guest is Kaz Okaya, the translator of Andrew Marin's Love is an Orientation and Wesley Hill's Washed and Waiting. And Washed and Waiting is a very popular work, especially a lot of people in the Side B community. It was their first book expressing this kind of about a Christian who still experiences same-sex attraction. And maybe, Aogu, did you help with that translation as well?
No, I see you nodding.
Oh, you did, you did.
No, I read through it. I contributed a foreword to the Japanese edition.
Okay. Oh, beautiful. And Kaz also worked on the Two Views on Homosexuality in the Church. Kaz is currently pursuing a PhD at Durham University, so Kaz is actually coming in from the UK. Kaz formerly served as an IFES, International Fellowship of Evangelical Students staff worker in Japan. And the local branch, you had abbreviated as KGK, and I was
Yes.
looking it up, and I was like, oh, here's my really bad Japanese, which is Kirisotosha Gakuseikai,
Oh, you got that right. Yes, yes.
which means Fellowship of Christian Students. So he's been deeply involved in recent theological discussions about faith and sexuality in Japan. Welcome again to both of you. So glad to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
TJ,
you.
would you like to just kick us off on our initial questions?
Yeah. So we hope in this conversation to talk about the translation efforts that you guys have been working on, as well as sort of an overview of conversations of faith and sexuality that you've been involved in Japan so far during your recent life. We hope to talk to Aogu more specifically in a different episode. But right now, we're trying to get this general perspective, general view, what is happening in your context as of now. So our first question is, what motivated each of you to engage in these translation projects around these particular texts? Because there's three pretty prominent texts that from the US context that were just translated. So yeah, what was your motivation? And you can even touch on how has the translation been received as of now? So.
Yeah, maybe I can start us off. So I think it was about 9 years ago when I was serving as a KGK staff. And KGK is, by the way, it's equivalent to InterVarsity in the US. So basically an InterVarsity staff worker. And I was working with students and I was having a blast. I mean, it was my dream job. And I was invited to this summer camp, a youth summer camp, as a messenger. And I made this weird character. I forgot the name. I named this Q&A box as a character. And the students could come and feed him with questions. And I thought it would be kind of like a fun idea to make this like monster that eats all these questions. And then I can kind of go back every night and read the questions and kind of address those the next day. To my surprise, almost 1/4 of the questions were related on LGBTQ issues. And the participants were all from very conservative evangelical churches, actually mostly middle school students, so about like 14, 15 years old. And at that time, I had absolutely no knowledge whatsoever of that topic. And 1/4 of the questions were on that topic. So I'm like, I can't answer this. Like, I know nothing. So I ended up doing was I went to a Christian bookstore, which is in Ochanomizu. In Tokyo, there's a interdenominational Christian tower, or a smaller towers. It's like a building called Ochanomizu Christian Center, where it's like a hub for evangelicals in Japan. They have all the denomination offices. They have a bookstore in the second floor. I went there and asked, hey, do you have any books on LGBTQ issues? The answer was 0. There was literally none in Japanese. And I was like, oh, but like all the youth the teenagers are all like, that is the question for them. And I'm like, why are there no translations? And then I looked up some other resources and I found a couple from very conservative kind of fundamentalist literature on conversion therapy. And I found few from very progressive kind of queer theology, but I couldn't find any literature from, people like the people I've translated, from more evangelical contexts. So that was kind of my initial probing that led me to, hey, what is this massive gap? And the students are asking about it, and there's like literally nothing in Japanese. And it was kind of like a black box, and I think people were just putting a lid on it, as it were, especially the evangelicals in Japan. They just pretended as if the situation did not exist, and I thought I had to do something about it. That was kind of my initial thing.
Thank you.
How about you, Aogu?
So I kind of joined in on these efforts actually with Washed and Waiting. And so, how I first, as you had mentioned earlier, we're going to be speaking a little bit more specifically about my journey hitherto in a future episode. But suffice it to say, I grew up within a Christian environment. I came to faith at an early age and subsequently discovered that I was having crushes on other guys. And so I didn't have a way at that time to reconcile those two realities in my life. I was fluctuating wildly from just pits of despair where I was fully convinced that I must be like reprobate and a false Christian because I'm gay. And then I would swing to just, the exact opposite, where I would have this sort of strong hope that, well, I'm Christian. So if I pray enough and, if I fast, or I was very into sort of historical Christian authors. I was like, maybe I should try some self-flagellation. Anyways, I thought that with enough effort, I would be able to overcome same-sex attraction. But I also found that that wasn't the case. I wasn't able to overcome that. And so it was after many years of struggling, a lot of that in isolation, that I came across Wesley Hill's Washed and Waiting. And so when I learned through Kaz that a translation was in the works, I was really excited to hear that. And when he asked whether I would be willing to write a foreword for that, a very short message recommending the book and sort of talking about some of the great things about it and my encounter with it, there was no way that I was going to say no.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm. So how many years has it been that the Washed and Waiting translation has been out?
I think it's exactly a year now.
Yeah, you're right.
How
Yeah.
can I ask in your church circles how that translation's been received?
Would you like to go, Kaz?
Okay. Yeah, I can go first. For me, it was very interesting because this was the second book I translated on this issue. First one was Andrew Marlin's Life as an Orientation, which I think is actually a bit more progressive, a lot more progressive than Hill's book. But that book was received very well in evangelical circles, and it opened a lot of avenue of dialogue. And I translated that, I think, about 5 years ago, or 4 or 5 years ago. I'm really bad with dates.
So that's had more time for reception.
Yes, but then, so Wesley Hill's book, which I think is far more conservative, received a lot of backlash. I received a lot of backlash myself, and it's because it was especially marketed. Well, it has to do with a bit of marketing tactics that the publisher, which is Word of Life Press, the biggest evangelical publication in Japan, they kind of marketed it as a memoir, a theological memoir, or of a faithful gay Christian. So that was kind of I can't speak English anymore, so when the book comes out, there's like a thing in the bottom, which kind of has like a little description. That was what he said.
Mm-hmm.
And so that wording, right? Gay Christian, the book by a gay Christian from an evangelical publisher, people just jumped into that. And without even reading the book, there are so many hate comments on Facebook and like YouTube, and these YouTube Christians who actually know personally, but they made these videos about like how Word of Life Press became Word of Death Press.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so it was all, and I kind of got tired, to be honest. At first I was trying to reply to these comments and kind of, have you read the book? And let us know how you feel after you actually read it, but then I kind of got tired after a while. And that was kind of my experience last year when it came out. I was kind of exhausted, to be honest, but it must have been a lot harder for Aogu as well, I think.
Yeah, I think I engaged with it as somebody who, what the publication of Washed and Waiting in Japanese signified to me was some of the first very public messaging of, or an articulation of side B theology within a Japanese context. And so the reception of Washed and Waiting, and, Kaz, you touched on a lot of the conservative, for lack of a better term, backlash to Washed and Waiting. And that certainly, it was discouraging to me in some ways, but actually in a lot of other ways, I was quite discouraged by the backlash from more affirming and mainline quarters of the church, actually. I think for me personally, while I have a side B theology, and I don't see it as some sort of secondary or tertiary issue. I do think it's a very important thing. Sexual ethics is, it's one of the things that they talked about in the Jerusalem Council, for example. It seems like a very important aspect of what Christian discipleship looks like. And at the same time, I do believe in dialogue. I do believe that it's possible for side A and side B Christians to coexist and even to encourage one another in the faith. That's something I'm seeking to practice. And so the backlash from side A, and some of it also uncritical, I think there was maybe some confusion among some about the identity of Dr. Wesley Hill, confusing him maybe with some other side Y authors is what I thought. But anyhow, yeah, it felt discouraging to feel in a sense like, even though it's not my intent, that some people are feeling this as a kind of betrayal, like I'm not a good gay, like I'm betraying the community in some way. And so that was that caused a lot of sorrow for me. And yet on an anecdotal level, just in personal interactions, I was actually quite encouraged through some other interactions. Like side A person talked about how they had been challenged. In their view, they thought that side B was basically just a theology of repression, and they realized that it could, for side B people, that it was a pathway to flourishing spiritually. And so they had felt that their stereotype had been challenged. And also from, more conservative quarters of the church, from evangelical quarters of the church, I received some encouraging feedback about how it stimulated thinking about fostering non-romantic relationships and friendships within the church, which I think is also another area of dialogue within the Japanese church that could use more of those conversations. So yeah, there was a lot of loud critiques, but there were personal interactions that I found quite encouraging.
And for Andrew Marin's work, he's straight, right? So I was just wondering, how much in the evangelical reception that it's like, oh, we can trust a straight person to write about this topic.
Right.
Yeah. On that kind of, so just the translation piece, I'm curious, with like, saying it's a gay, a memoir, a theological memoir of a gay Christian, but how is that said in Japanese?
I'm gonna pop up the book right now. It says, 神に忠実でありたいと願うゲイクリスチャン、心の旅 is exactly the Japanese phrasing. It means literally, it's, what's the word? Spiritual journey of a gay Christian who wants to be faithful to God. That was the wording.
And so did I hear right that you guys just use the English word gay in the title directly, or is there a...
Yes, that's the difficulty, because there's no word called celibate in Japanese. And so I had a lot of talk with the publisher about how I can translate that notion of celibate gay Christian, which is very difficult. And their suggestion was, what about Christians who wish to be faithful? So faithful gay Christian. So that's why it was kind of phrased that way. And then also, as you all know, in the introduction, I think it was in the introduction where he kind of clarifies how the word gay is used, right? To kind of denote identity, not as kind of an all-consuming identity, but as just one aspect of identity. And so the assumption was, if the reader had read the introduction along with that wording, they will understand precisely what that wording means.
Yeah.
But as it turned out, people just assumed from the cover without reading the intro, and
Can you just speak to more of what kind of difficulties do you run into, translating from English into Japanese? I speak a little bit of Spanish, and so that's my main context for knowing, like, there's certain ideas or concepts that just don't perfectly translate from one language into another, and sometimes that also reflects different cultural values and cultural differences. So I'm wondering what was highlighted as some of these differences as you went into the translation work.
Yeah, Aogu might have some more, but for me especially, there were two major difficulties. One was on words related to transformation, which is like henka in Japanese, which is difficult because Hill does use the word quite a lot in the book. But when I try to translate into Japanese, it kind of connotates conversion therapy or, what kind of change, right? And I didn't want to give that kind of impression, but it is a change nonetheless, but it's not a change as people would expect it to be. So that I wanted to be careful with. And also another difficulty was words related to disability. So in Japanese, especially, words related to disability is considered very rude. So people wouldn't use that anymore. So when speaking with the publishers, some of the words were changed. And especially, I forgot exactly where he was, but in one of the parts when Wesley talked about the similarity between same-sex attraction and the innateness of, well, not disability per se, but some of the post-fall condition, which is natural. So it's not a choice, right? So I think he made some examples of that. And I had to change the wording a bit. And I think that had both positive and negative effects because it kind of, one of the critiques of Washington Waiting was that, yeah, people didn't see where Wesley was coming from because some of the wordings were kind of, I don't know, flattened out into Japanese. So, yeah, so that was a hard part, translating the two difficult, potentially controversial words into Japanese. And
Thank you. Could I ask, is the distinction between orientation and behavior, that's a pretty prominent side B distinction. Does that come through when you're attempting to translate in Japanese from English or else talk about these concepts in Japanese?
Behavior is actually a difficult word to translate. And I had problems with that. And orientation is not that hard.
Okay.
There is a specific translation called seishiko or a shikosei, which is exactly orientation. But behavior usually translates as koi, which is act. So it is more specific as intercourse or, but behavior I think is a broader term. So that was, a bit difficult to translate as well, I think.
I ask in part because I noticed you used gay in that short phrase you used. And I speak an African language. And when I say the word like gay, it immediately means behavior. It does not, it doesn't, to make this, in English now, gay can mean, in some versions of English, gay means patterns of attraction, right?
Right.
And some forms of English still, there's English speakers who just use it to mean behavior. In the African language I use, it just means behavior because they weren't conceptualizing orientation, 500 years ago when it emerged or whatever. So how was that for you? Why are you using an English loanword, gay, rather than, is there a Japanese word that indicates something similar? Like how did you handle this difference?
There is, in Japanese, there used to be a pejorative term called okama. And it has been used in popular culture ever since the 1980s. And then there's been many, what you would today call trans women, trans men on TV. And they were very popular. And there's this word okama or onabe, were kind of a pejorative term, but it was more kind of like a clown word almost. Like, so people will make fun of these characters, but then they're very popular and you see them all the time on TV. So in Japan, there was this interesting culture called okama or onabe culture where trans people or gay people were kind of almost celebrated, but at the same time kind of made fun of. And you see them every day on TV. So very different cultural background from the US, where there was a moral majority and, the Christian, very different. But I think the gay loan word came recently, I think, to distinguish from that okama, or because it kind of had that pejorative sense. So I think the loan word gay is being used more these days rather than like okama or onabe, which has that negative or even kind of a mockery to it a bit.
Interesting. Well, that makes me wonder, I'm a social scientist, in a lot of human cultures, gay sexual behavior, it ties to what we now call transness. Like those two phenomena go together. Is from what I heard from you saying is in Japanese, that was part of the experience of same-sex sexual desire, same-sex sex was kind of trans nonconformity. Is that true? Do you guys know?
Yes,
Or was it? Yeah.
It's very, that whole history is actually pretty complicated because it
Okay.
started from the Edo period where there were male and female prostitutes. So it came from that culture, and there's been a lot of confusion, and especially because ever since the 1980s, there were a lot of prominent celebrities who would identify as okama or onabe, and so there wasn't precise distinctions between the LGBT, for example, like
Yeah.
between the gayness and trans, and it was kind of all mixed up. And
Yes.
so I think that's precisely why they kind of had to borrow the loan words from English to make precise
Yeah.
distinctions. Yeah.
Yeah. It's from what I understand, it's relatively rare among human cultures to have like what we call cis gay. It's not unknown, but it's more rare. But now a lot of people live a cis gay life. Like you stay in your sex, but you are mostly attracted to the same sex.
Right.
A lot of people they if they're gender non-conforming, they're also gay, and they take on they live the life of the other sex, basically.
Right.
This is a complex history. It's different all over the world, but it's something that I'd love to talk more about in the future. So I appreciate you sharing that from the Japanese context, because it's part of the conversation generally. So
Yes, and especially I just wanted to highlight one aspect of Japanese culture. In Japanese culture, there were no women actors. So women were kind of banned from being actors. And so it was all men who would portray themselves as women, and they would wear makeups, and they would play the role of women. And so there is that kind of, it's called joso in Japanese, where you kind of put on this role of a woman. And that has been engraved in Japanese art and culture.
Yeah.
So I think it is that different it has that different cultural backdrop with other cultures, I think, that specific history. Yeah.
Yeah. Because Western society has often been skeptical of gender bending or this gender nonconformity. Not always, but I would say broadly. So, yeah.
Well, for men, as particularly
for men, yeah.
a little more open to it in the
For women,
It's like
yeah.
tomboy history
Yeah,
for young
Yeah,
women,
it's kind
especially.
of mixed. Can we now move to a more general question? I'm curious, what have the conversations on faith and sexuality been like in Japan over the past few decades, over your lifetime? My impression is you're both from evangelical backgrounds, so you might know that best. But yeah, I'd be curious, what have the conversations been like over your lifetime or before?
Right. It's good because me and Aogu we're both from the evangelical context, so we're from a bit of a different background, where Aogu is more from international and maybe a bit more charismatic church back. Is that fair to say that? Or I don't know.
In recent years, yeah.
In recent years, right. Why am I? But for me, I was in a more conservative evangelical predominantly Japanese context. So I think quite different cultures there. This is one of the problems of Japanese mission too, that there's a bit of a divide between the international churches and the Japanese native churches. But that's one problem in Japan right now. But speaking from my context, I think the talk on sexuality in general has been a very important distinguishing marker for evangelicals. And I grew up, when I was in high school, I still remember reading Josh Harris's book,
Oh yeah,
what was
Stating
the title?
Goodbye.
Yes, Stating Goodbye, yes.
Yeah.
That was a bestseller. The Japanese translation of it was a bestseller among youth, right? So we were all reading his book in high school growing up and debating about it. Like, is this, what do you make of it? And I mean, now obviously I will not endorse it whatsoever, but like at the time it was kind of like, is this good? Or, and people were debating about it all the time. And there were other books from Western thinkers like Tim Keller's Meaning of Marriage and other books translated into Japanese. And also there were a lot of prominent Japanese evangelicals writing on that topic as well. And so I think it was one of the distinguishing markers of evangelical identity. It's that notion of sexual fidelity, or, I don't know, putting emphasis on family life and, faithfulness and chastity. Those kind of things were kind of the evangelical identity markers for Japanese evangelicals, I think. I'm curious what Aogu thinks. So,
Yeah, growing up in a more international church myself, I definitely read Josh Harris, discussed it in groups. That was very much a common theme as well. It's actually sort of a window into a side of the church hearing you speak, Kaz, that I didn't previously have. But it's interesting how much your experience actually maps onto my own. Yeah.
What are thinking about some of the generational differences? Like, as TJ said, in his African context, if he says the word gay, people are immediately thinking about gay sex acts. And that in the US, for many grandparents, that would be very similar. If you were to say, oh, I'm gay, they're thinking you're having sex. Why are you having sex with people? Are there similar generational divides in your communities?
I think so. I think the older generation tend to be more conservative, and also because they're not usually, I don't want to put stereotypes, but they usually are not on the web, or they're not as conversant in the discussions happening on the internet or on the Twitter, or so they're not up to date, as it were, in terms of those discussions. So yes, one of the many misunderstandings I received were from older generations. When we translated Wesley Hill's book, just by the judgment that came just by looking at the title, I think.
But it's a common enough word that they at least know something of what it means.
Right. Yes.
Has this conversation in Japan developed at the same time as increasing like political accessibility for gay people to marriage or to rights or things? I don't know the history of gay marriage in Japan, but yeah, has this developed at the same time, or are they separate, or are they not? Yeah, they're not related at all.
Yeah, what do you think, Aogu?
So 10 years ago, support for same-sex marriage in Japan was at about 40%, whereas 2 years ago, it's reached about 70%.
Okay.
And so it does, America has often been sort of a cultural big brother to Japan. And I think 2015 was kind of a watershed moment for the US with regard to same-sex marriage, as I recall.
Yeah.
And so I do think that there has been an effect sort of within Japan, within sort of popular perception regarding gay relationships in Japan in the last decade.
Is gay marriage legal in Japan?
It's the only G7 country that doesn't recognize same-sex marriages.
But there's been several very important lawsuits considering this case, especially I think last year in Sapporo high. I can't translate 高等裁判所 into English. So there are different levels of judicial office, but there was several important. So there's been a lot of legal lawsuits from same-sex married couples kind of suing the country or the government. And there's been a bit of a different local, so like the Hokkaido prefecture and other places, there have been some local decisions being made, but not in terms of a national thing yet, I think.
I see.
Interesting. In the US, there, for a brief time, or I don't know how brief, people were trying to create the distinction between marriage and civil unions. And it unfortunately never really fully developed, and civil unions kind of have faded away. And people try to just map it all into marriage.
But they do exist in some jurisdictions in the U.S. But it's like
yes, they still exist in certain states, certain municipalities, but they don't hold the same type of federal, national weight that they have. And anyway, so I'm curious. Part of that is very much tied in that most people get married in churches. You can get married in the court, but
it's been uncommon
most of the time,
like our parents and grandparents mostly got married in churches in the U.S. Not everyone, but it was common. Yeah.
And so part of that's I think plays into the fight around like the definition of marriage because it is so much tied to the church. And I'm curious how that maps or doesn't map into Japanese state and church relationships.
Yes, in Japan there's also something called, I think it's called partnership sensei seido. And this is a very recent development. So I think it first started in 2015, the partnership. I can't translate this in English, but it's called Sensei Seido. The commitment started, I think, first in Shibuya in 2015, and it massively grew within this past 10 years. I think it is approximately now covers 65% of the whole nation. So different local governments are authorizing partnerships, and it's becoming more and more available throughout Japan. And that's been happening. The first case was 2015, and now it's 65%. So it's growing in a massive speed, I think.
If you were in that type of partnership, would people assume that it is a like asexual relationship, or it could be a brother and a cousin, different people coming together in household relationships? What are the connotations or assumptions with that partnership?
I think it's usually understood as equivalent to marriage. And so I think although it is different from same-sex marriage, which is not legally admitted in Japan, it is kind of considered as an equivalent to it. So I think it does have that sexual connotation as well. Although I can't speak for obviously all the couples who are in that relationship. But yeah.
Do you guys have any opinions just yourself of like where do you think that like if that type of partnership was like that would be sufficient in order to create rooms for gay couples to come together, whether celibate or not? It's not everybody's Christian and trying to pursue that, and not all Christians, have the side B perspective. Or is there something that marriage provides uniquely, or is it more so just a social recognition piece? How good if you want to start, any thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, I think probably I think actually my brain just got scrambled and I was confusing some information from the States and from Japan. But I do believe, as I understand it, the partnership system that's provided by different municipalities in Japan, that is not equivalent in terms of its legal protections.
No.
Things related to, for example, who can visit somebody at a hospital, for example. Perhaps that's changed. I'm not sure. Or
it's still the same. I think. Right?
Is it? Yeah. Or things like inheritance law. Those things. I don't believe that the protections aren't equivalent, and so I think that there is definitely, even with the increasing coverage of the population under these municipalities, partnership systems, there is a fairly strong push still for marriage equality.
Yes, sorry, I need to kind of back up a bit and to avoid misunderstanding. What I meant that in terms of social perception, many people perceive of that partnership as kind of what's the word in English? Daitai. You know how to say this in English? Like a daitai.
Alternative?
Alternative? Yeah, alternative is a better word than equivalent. Alternative to marriage. So many people, when we hear that, they'll say partnership, they will assume that you are in a sexual relationship. So I was speaking about perception more than the legal definition. So legally speaking, there's not the legal, it's not the same. Yeah. They don't have any legal,
Mask I think many Japanese are not Christians, okay?
Most.
If you most, okay.
Yes.
If you come out as someone who's gay, or is in a non-Christian community or family in Japan, how do you think it will be received? How do you think they engage with their family? What options do they see for their life? Yeah.
May I speak to this?
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you. So I think that in Japan, only about 22, I believe, % of LGBT people are out to their families. Only about 28% are out to their workplaces. And so there is a fairly strong pressure not to come out in Japan. The reason for that, though, I think it is different in many ways from in the States, in that, though there might be some similar currents as well within the culture, but any resistance to that in Japan isn't based on a historically Judeo-Christian moral framework that views same-sex relationships with a sense of moral outrage or disgust. In general, obviously I can't speak for everybody. And there have been people like a certain politician who said that they would not even want to see gay people and they would be troubled if a gay person lived nearby. So there are people like that. I'm not sure how much that came from moral outrage, though. But one really strong current within Japanese culture is a pressure to conform or a pressure to appear the same as others. And so maybe in a similar way to how individuality is so celebrated in the States. And it's not so simple as to say like individuality is like a horrible thing to have in Japan. But as much as you're able to fit in with the rest of society, the less friction there is in life. And that gets reinforced through sort of patterns of like, oh, this person's acting too different, maybe we should shun them, and maybe even in a friendly way somewhat ridicule them, but we all know how we feel about this person. So both within workplaces, within schools, within families, there's a fairly strong sort of obstacle, rather robust obstacle to queer people coming out and being known as they are. And I would say that those same pressures do exist within the church as well, with an added layer of sort of like, if I come out, I'll be morally questioned.
Interesting. Can we talk more about the church, the divisions between the churches on faith and sexuality? You implied that there's a prominent distinction between evangelicals and then the mainline churches, which is similar in the US, but like very different in my African context, where the mainline are also in agreement on faith and sexuality. Like everyone is.
Right.
So yeah, I'm curious. Yeah. How is that playing out? So.
Yeah, I can go first. It's very interesting because I think evangelicals in different contexts mean something completely different, which I learned when I did my master's in Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Chicago amidst the Trump elections. During the Trump elections, I was like, I thought I was an evangelical, maybe not.
Maybe not.
Maybe not. But Japanese evangelicals are actually united with the mainline church in terms of their anti-nationalist stance, and also in terms of pacifism.
Okay.
So in the political sphere, they are actually relatively on the same page because of the negative. I actually wrote an article in Christianity Today on this, which is coming out soon.
You have to share with us. The link comes. Yeah.
Yes. But I think it's because of the negative history we have during World War II, where the nationalistic Christianity kind of took over and kind of really made all the invasion and idolatrous imperial worship crept into the churches and legitimized all that. And so we went through a whole process of repentance and saw how nationalism can really damage the church. So that's something that we have in common with the mainline. But in terms of sexuality, it's quite a different story. I think it's different from Africa in the sense that African churches, in the sense that there is a big divide in Japan concerning sexuality with the mainline and evangelicals, in that evangelicals tend to be way more conservative. Although politically they're on the same, well, I don't know if sexuality counts as politics, but you know what I mean. In terms of like nationalism and pacifism, they're on the same page, but in terms of sexuality, they're pretty divided, I think.
It's refreshing to hear pacifism included in that, because Americans love their guns.
They're not so pacifistic.
And I come from a Mennonite and a Baptist background, so pacifism's in my family history, and so I've had some culture shocks when visiting Baptists. Churches that are in that it's just like, oh, war and military and things have never been part of my history.
Yes, I was shocked when I went to small group and they were like, "You want to go gun shooting?" I'm like, did I hear that correctly? What, did you literally mean gun shooting, or is that a metaphor? Or something?
They literally mean gun shooting. Yes. So you obviously you guys both know the sides language that emerged from US English. Is there a way of distinguishing the views in Japan that may not use that language, or do people say, what do they say to distinguish the perspectives at play in this conversation.
What do you think, Aogu?
There is language that's used a lot of times. I think it tends to actually be fairly descriptive. And so I think a lot of times people, because of the lack of, shorthand terms like side B, side A, which, because of the lack of terms like that, a lot of times people might actually be more specific and just say, this person doesn't agree with same-sex marriage, or this person does, or this person believes that gay people should become straight. And so in some ways, actually, I feel that the lack of language and sort of agreed upon terminology within this conversation has served as a benefit in certain ways. I do think personally, though, there's also sort of the detriment in that I feel that in the 10 years that I've been having this sort of parasocial relationship with side B in the States through the internet, it's really developed from sort of a theological category into a community with the advent of things like Revoice. And so I do feel that lack within a Japanese context of there isn't really a word to coalesce around. So I guess that's one way that I feel the difference in the Japanese language and context.
And you're so true. The terminology has helped a subculture form for side B especially. And there's like, we have our cultural norms, we have our practices, we have institutions, we have our language, we have all the things. So it is different if you don't have a term to coalesce around. So
Right. I did write 2 articles in Japanese Christian magazines, kind of not defining, but kind of introducing the distinctions between the different sides in the US. But one of the things that I wrote there was that, especially in recent years, the backlash side B received, and especially after the Nashville statement, or more recently on the Twitter space, it's horrible when, I tend to shy away from it because it's, not always healthy. But the sides have become more rigid. And I think in the heyday, when Washington Waiting came out, there was not so much of even hate between side B and side Y folks. There was a sense of like, well, we might disagree on some issues about like how we name things, but we're still on the same side kind of thing. But after, Butterfield kind of calling out the side B people and all that, there's been like a massive wall now. And I'm hoping that won't happen in Japan. So that was like my big hope. At the one point, I wanted to introduce that categories, but I'm like, but I don't want to introduce these categories as like a rigid, no breakable wall that will divide people. So
That's definitely a tension, even I think especially between B and Y, because you have, for those who are less familiar, side B is the traditional sexual ethic, but are pretty open-handed with how people want to talk about it and describe themselves and their sexual orientations. And the difference between the side Y is mainly just around language. It's this, if you use this type of language that connects with the LGBTQ community, then you are doing something potentially really evil. And what's tough is that there's some people who just like, for whatever reasons, I don't associate a lot with the queer community. And so that language doesn't work for me. And so they kind of feel like they fit in this side Y position, but they actually don't have, it's not a moral stance, it's just a discomfort. And doing that work to distinguish, just because I'm not comfortable being called gay doesn't mean that I think those who do are in fact evil. And so it's like, well, theologically, you're actually kind of side B. You're open-handed. You hold the conservative position, but your own use of language allows you to like be under the safety and not be called out by a Rosaria Butterfield. And then she creates this big wall of saying like, and if you cross that line, then you are identifying with sin and da-da-da and da-da-da. And there's actually a ton of people who kind of wouldn't be critiqued by Rosaria Butterfield, who I would say, come be part of the side B community. And Revoice has been intentional about including SSA, same-sex attracted language as well, to try to make that clear. TJ and I, inspired by Meg Batts, have appreciated just the shorthand of QSSA, queer SSA, just as a nice like umbrella term. But definitely there's people, even the language of side in English can be like this side or this side, they're very different. And like, is there a perspective or view, that kind of softens a little bit to try to bring back some of the dialogue that I think used to even exist in Rosario Butterfield's earlier works.
Right, yes,
more
even
vitriolic over time.
Yes, even people like Christopher Yuan, I think, used to be way more open-minded.
He did.
It was quite shocking, seeing him kind of critiquing people like Sprinkle, like really badly.
Yeah, I know.
Well, I'm like, what happened?
I just have to say, David Frank and I think about this very differently, so I just have to make that point. I'm much more skeptical of side Y, and I don't think the difference is language. I think it's a fundamental posture of thinking gayness or queerness is only evil. And that's where the language politics emerges from. It's not just we don't like language. It's this is bad, a disease, something. So, anyways, I just have to make that statement here. Yeah, that is.
No, fair point. Of what's the underlying moral reasoning of why they think that language and that identity framework is connected, but even that of just like it is also just actually getting down into like, well, what when you say gay, what do you mean? When what is the queer experience? And TJ has a much larger sphere of what that all can mean. And when other people are trying to really just name like a sinful temptation. Anyways, we don't need to go down that rabbit hole.
It's very interesting to hear your sort of articulating those differences actually, as somebody who I think I mostly inhabit sort of spaces where side Y kind of theology would be predominant. Side Y or side X, actually. But very much sort of the primary critique I have faced is with regard to language. And I think in certain sort of charismatic streams, I think there's especially a understanding of how language and the ways that we self-define sort of, I want to be careful with how I use language as I describe this, but how that's something that has the potential to sort of create realities in a sense. And so when I say things like, I'm gay, which, when I say something like that, that to me merely is an accurate description of aspects of my existence and experience. The way that is interpreted is like, well, in sort of a similar way, actually, to the way that you said this, TJ, like, well, gay is this, it's sort of a spiritual domain that when you name that spiritual domain as something that you're a part of, you're sort of entering into and sort of submitting yourself to, and that has a mind of its own, and it will take you to a certain place. So it's very interesting to hear that.
I've had sideway friends, straight people who hold sideway theology. They told me you can't say gay because it's essentially demonic. You're putting yourself under the principality of a demon. And I'm like, what? You and I are using this term so differently, my friend. I'm totally just describing this experience of an orientation that I have that's been enduring for like my life. I don't intend to walk under any other kingdom than the kingdom of God. So I'm not trying to put myself under the kingdom of this demon that you think exists based on that terminology. But so that's part of the reason why I'm skeptical of side Y and the way David Frank is less, because I engage these people, charismatics, Africans and people from the US, and they say like this thing, you're putting yourself under a principality of a demon by saying these terms. And I'm just like, what?
Wow.
And I think that's where that necessarily you see side Y speakers becoming more embraced by side X, those who are advocating then for like, well, then if you're not claiming the domain of homosexuality, then you have to claim the domain of heterosexuality, and you have to embrace that, and you have to be transformed in these ways. And so the stronger you start to moralize around that and spiritualize these things, I think it starts to send you, just because like, well, like I have nowhere else to go. I have to just run towards heterosexuality, and that's the way to stay safe, stay safe in holiness. And I definitely, yeah, it's because words do create reality. Like there is, I think we've all of like, more than any of our, fallen conditions, we can name and say we are beloved. We are beloved in Christ. And those words are meaningful and powerful.
That's true.
And we are meant to anchor ourselves, around certain words that do have transformative effects. But when it gets kind of legalistic and
Well, the question also is gayness bad? To what extent is it bad? Is queerness just wrong? Or does God have intentions for queerness? Can queerness be a gift or it's only disease? Like these sort of these are the tensions that we're playing with, or like how we're trying to conceptualize this thing. So side B often has they're open to the possibilities of queerness being a gift or being good in some ways, even if there's an issue or there's part that can go towards evil or something, Yeah. Anyways, it's complexity versus nuance. It's complexity and nuance versus a simplistic binary. That's how I think of it sometimes.
Yeah. It was really, I don't know if you've seen the recent debate between Sean McDowell and President Sprinkle, but like McDowell went through the whole process of how he changed about the connotation of gay from before, how he was okay with using it, but now he feels it is wrong. And I felt like that whole shift has happened not only in the side-wide community, but at larger evangelical institutions at large in the US.
Yeah.
And so I was thinking, how can I prevent this in Japan? Like, because we have a different language to begin with, right? Like, we have a different language. I mean, gay is not Japanese. I mean, that's the English word. It's a loan word. So like, how can I translate things, or I don't know, write articles in a way that would not lead to that kind of, I seriously think it's a false dichotomy, or I don't know, a false battle between, and so that's my big challenge, because as I said previously, like those terms like gay didn't exist in Japanese, and we kind of incorporated that to make precise distinctions. But if that precise distinctions leads into precise tribes, or, like a wall between people, I don't want to do that. So like how can we, pastor use this pastorally and not create that wall? Yeah.
I was going to ask you, if in your experience, if a Christian in some of these Japanese churches comes out as gay, if they decide to talk about it, will the first response be to go to the ex-gay ministry? Or what would the first response be for a Christian who would come out to his or her Christian family members, Christian church, neighbors, whatever?
I don't know that I have a particularly helpful response, seeing how I grew up in kind of basically an American church in Japan.
Yeah, I think from my very Japanese evangelical church background, there used to be an organization called Pro-Life Japan, and which was kind of, there still is, sorry, I'm not past tense, but it used to be kind of, it still is a very, very big promoter of sexual ethics. And there's a famous pastor who used to work there, who is now independent, whom I now work together doing different projects. But in Japan, because of that stigma attached to the word, or even the notion of having same-sex attraction in general, creates this sense of stigma. So people would usually do that under the rug, as it were. So like they would go to the pastors or particular people who have experienced similar things and would talk about it kind of without telling anyone else. So I can think of two people who a person will probably talk to. And one is a pastor called Kiyoshi Mizutani, who used to be the head of Pro-Life Japan, but he resigned and he's now doing an individual. He's a very prominent author, writing a lot of books, and he is very sympathetic to the side B position as well. And he kind of operates as like a counselor in terms of those sexual ethics. So people will probably talk to him. And there's also another side A pan-evangelical organization called Yakusoku no Niji, which translates as the Promised Rainbow. And actually, my friend actually runs that organization, but we used to go to our high school ministry together. But yes, that's another option that they would go to talk to, knowing that that would be a bit more of a progressive space. But one of the difficulty is that pastors or youth ministers wouldn't know about that because most of the time they would feel uncomfortable talking to pastors for the fear of being judged or for the fear of being, I don't know, shamed, or so they would kind of wrestle alone without telling anybody, reading different books, consuming different literature. And that's where I think lies the danger as well. And I actually had an opportunity to talk to different Japanese pastors about this, and I asked how many percentage within your congregation would identify as LGBTQ, and they said most of the evangelical church pastors that I talked to said none. But I know that there are people within those congregations from my personal, and they'll say, no, that doesn't apply to us. I'm like, are you sure about that? So I think it's that culture of shame and conformity that kind of pushes people not to talk to pastors or any Christians. And I think the primary resources they have are either books or online spaces, which can be harmful, or those two different organizations that I mentioned.
Interesting. Another question I had is in the side B in the US movement, and maybe Europe as well, Eastern, maybe UK, the Anglosphere of side B, there's emerging conversations around new types of kinship. David Frank and I, we talk about this often, and that includes things like intentional community together. It includes things like covenant brotherhood, covenant sisterhood, covenant siblinghood, committed friendship, spiritual friendship, many different ideas. This was referenced previously in our conversation, but I wanted to ask, are these conversations emerging at all in Japan? These conversations around these types of kinship that are not marriage? And if they are, what is it? What are the conversations? How is the conversation going?
I think in some ways there isn't a critical mass of people sort of with an interest in those topics at the present for those discussions to develop, at least within my experience. And so I'm not currently aware of any discussions like that within the church in Japan.
Got it.
Yes, same, especially because one of the motivations for me to translate Andrew Marlin's book and Wesley Hill's book in the first place was because in Japan there was either side A or side X. Those were like the two options until very recently. So until Wesley Hill's book came out last year, people didn't really know that position existed, especially in the Japanese churches. So I think it's something very new for many people. And I am hoping that more pastorally sensitive and helpful ways of new kinds of kinship and friendship will emerge within the Japanese churches. But yes, we are kind of waiting to see what will come out of it.
And within the current sort of,
No, continue.
Oh, sorry. Just even with the brief mentions of related topics within Washed and Waiting, and then also in the two views on homosexuality, the Bible, and the church, some of the critiques have been very targeted towards what Dr. Wesley Hill's sort of the way that he articulates his vision for spiritual friendship. And I think there is a perception among some people that that's basically just sort of a different word for basically a same-sex marriage.
Right.
And so I think there's a lot of suspicion against new forms of kinship currently in Japan.
Yeah, I was trying to think. In the U.S., there's some kind of overlapping concerns, areas of interest for, like, maybe singles in the church and saying, hey, just because you're single, you still have a role. You don't have to be married to be valuable. There's also a movement of intentional Christian communities that I'm tied into. And I was like, oh, are there any in Japan? And I think there's at least one Bruderhof community in Japan somewhere, but I don't know of any widespread kind of movements of more intentional community, but would definitely be interested. TJ maybe will join in on research to see what type of covenant brotherhood ceremonies have existed in Japanese culture historically that could be used, to revive this out of so it's not just borrowing from marriage.
It's funny. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I don't know. The first thing that came up in mind was Yakuza. So, in Japanese culture, the Japanese gangs have really emphasized covenant
Mm.
brotherhood. And it's called chigiri in Japanese, and it comes from the samurai spirit, but they would drink the sake together
Yeah.
as a covenantal commitment that
Yeah.
you belong, your destinies are together, and you will fight together when you're in a gang. And this might not be the most helpful analogy since it's an antisocial group that I'm talking about, the Yakuza. But I think there might be like something to that, you know. So drinking the sake together as a covenantal is a pretty Japanese expression of covenant brotherhood.
And I assume in a previous history, you said among the samurai, it is a longer history than just Yakuza. Okay.
Is that the same thing you were thinking about, Aogu?
Yeah, I was thinking actually about sort of brotherhood covenant, and the same word chigiri is used actually, I believe, within the context of basically there was a sort of similar system to pederasty in ancient Greece. There was a similar sort of system of relationships among samurai warrior class in Japan from the warring states period into, well, from be like the 1300s into around 1600 and going into the sort of early modern period of Japan. And so, but this sort of brother making ceremony as it existed, from what I understand, and I'm definitely nothing like an expert in this at all, but from what I understand, it was called brotherhood, but it was a sexual relationship.
Oh, interesting.
And so I do wonder if there is a way in which, I don't believe that things related to sort of medieval Japanese sexual practices are that well remembered in Japan nowadays. But it is, I feel that there would be quite a strong suspicion against
Understood.
things like, brother making.
It is interesting though. I study this. This is my main research is brother making thing around the world. And it's common. It's quite common among a lot of human societies all around the world. But you're right. Some examples were sexually involved, but many were not. And like the Christian ones historically were not. You know, like early that was not the intention, because obviously Christian sexual ethics have a certain trajectory and they believe certain things.
Right.
But yeah. So we've forgotten it in a lot of contexts that these were part of just human life. And so anyways, hopefully before too long we'll have a more researched in-depth conversation around this in contemporary times. So
Right.
Amen.
It's interesting because even in contemporary times, there are a lot of in Japan, there's a bit of a subculture for ex-Yakuza pastors and ex-Yakuza community.
Yeah, sure.
Which I'm not too involved with because I wasn't a Yakuza before. But I knew a couple of people from that community, and they have a really strong sense of brotherhood because they grew up in this Yakuza where they would like do the chigiri, not in a sexual connotation, but they are the brotherhood and they fight together. And then that has been translated into the Christian context of discipleship. So many they still operate as kind of like a clan almost. And they call themselves brothers, and some of them live together and they help out each other. They do business together. And so there is that Japanese subculture of like ex-Yakuza pastors, and not only pastors, but also ex-Yakuza people who kind of follow the former leaders, you know. And but that is a bit of a small subculture, but it does kind of exist, I think. So.
Yeah.
So aside from Yakuza maybe being our best hope for new kinship in Japan, are there other hopes that you guys have for just how things will grow or evolve in the near future?
In Japan, the current context is very interesting because I feel like Japanese evangelicals tend to be more progressive than the US. So there has been a book published by one very prominent evangelical author, fully affirming recently, with a fully affirming stance, and a couple of prominent pastors have kind of endorsed that. So many of the Japanese, I wouldn't say many, but there is this branch within Japanese evangelicalism which is fully affirming, who are kind of the most well-known evangelical scholars or pastors in Japan. So it's a bit different from the US in the sense that, it's a bit of a different theological climate, I feel. I don't know if that's good or bad, or
depends on your
but
position,
hopefully, Right. But then I do think there is more space for dialogue precisely because many of those pastors or theologians are in those prominent places. For example, like a head of a theological institution or a chief translator of the Japanese Bible, for example, Japanese Evangelical Bible, for example. So I do think there are more avenues for dialogue compared to like the US where people can't just talk to each other anymore. It's
there's a lot of
so
arguments.
that's my hope. It's
Do those prominent pastors and translators, do they know of perspectives beyond affirming and then ex-gay? Like, do they know of side B, or it's not what they're thinking of really?
They do know of it, but I think only recently
Oh, I see.
because of Hill's book.
Yeah.
And I've been in dialogue with many of them these past few years. And at first they were like, this doesn't make sense.
Oh, sure.
But yes, I think they are becoming more aware of it recently and still kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
And I might add, in large part due to your work, I believe, Kaz.
Thank you.
And I'm very grateful for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, hopefully, I mean, if the Lord uses anything, but
I'm really grateful, though. I'm sorry to have like a emotional moment, but
No problem.
but like when I first contacted you on Twitter as well, it was very much in the context of, oh, I'm speaking to you, Kaz, but it was in the context of the Nashville statement was translated into Japanese. I had, just this really strong feeling of dread that it would become sort of a shibboleth for evangelicals.
Right.
And
yes.
and it was kind of in that context that you were, along with some other of these leaders that I think you're talking about right now, you kind of came forward and said, hey, can we try to avoid shutting down dialogue? Can we actually seek to foster healthy dialogue? And I've been one of the beneficiaries of that. And so, yeah, my gratitude is for you. And I really believe that the Lord is using you to do something powerful. The Lord has used you to do something powerful in my life.
Amen. Praise God.
Well, it's really humbling.
Amen. Yeah, praise God indeed.
But to give a bit of context in what I was mentioning about, so the Nashville statement was translated into Japanese recently.
I'm sorry.
By this organization called NBUS. So NBUS stands for, what does it stand for? I forgot how it stands for. Network for Biblical Understanding of Sexuality.
Oh.
So that is the organization NBUS, which translated Nashville statement. And there was a strong petition, people writing for it and against it. And there was also another organization came out called Christians Against NBUS. So there were these two groups, right?
And they were specifically Japanese, or these
specifically Japanese. Side X position, NBUS, Side X people kind of writing for conversion. Well, they wouldn't say they are conversion therapists, but pretty much in the Side X camp, I would say. And then people who are pretty much in the affirming side, really critiquing NBUS. And I saw like the churches were kind of torn. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to translate Wesley's book.
Yeah.
As not a third way, but I thought there were better ways to talk about things. You don't have to. It's not a binary as
Yeah.
Well, but as we wrap up, are there any final thoughts that you two would like to share?
Yes, I can just share a really quickly. So I was invited to join this not organization, kind of a dialogue group called Dream Party. I forgot who made that word up. It's a really interesting word, but their dream was to have a healthy dialogue with different spaces. And I was invited as one of the dialogue members, and there were a few other pastors, one including the prominent evangelical leader who recently published a book on the affirming side of things. But one serious difficulty that we are facing is, what does it mean to dialogue? Who do we dialogue with? Who do we engage with? As much as we want, or I want to dialogue with anybody, I think there's a difference between content and attitude, or belief and attitude, because I'm open to dialogue with people from any beliefs or any ideology, as long as they're respectful and as long as they're not like shouting at you from the onset, right? But many people do behave in that way, and they will even say the way that my attitude is part of my opinion. You know, my challenge right now is I really hope for dialogue, but how far should I dialogue without hurting others, right? Because sometimes engaging in dialogue with people who have a harmful attitude could actually send wrong messages to people, and I don't want to do that. So that's my big concern right now. Like, how do I engage? Who do I choose my interlocutors, or should I choose? Should I be choosing? Or that's one thing that I still haven't figured out yet. Yes.
It's hard. It's hard.
May I ask a question from the two of you?
Yeah, you're welcome.
Because I know that for the two of you, you also do engage across the sides. And you've spoken with different side A people. You've spoken with people that I believe are sort of represent sort of a side X view even. And so what do you have any guiding principles in your selection process of interlocutors?
EJ, I'll let you start.
I mean, I think the chief principle is a hermeneutic of charity, like, and have an interpretive framework of charity. But also, I like to say, and justice, both, because we want to be loving, but we also want to represent their view as fairly as possible, which could include the bad and the good. We won't, at least this is me, I won't pretend, if you think gay people should go through ex-gay therapy, I will not pretend you don't think that. I will say, you think this, and that is what you think. And that is the just way to interpret you, even as I try to give you the benefit of the doubt. But yeah, I think for side A people, we've had principles of choosing people who we have seen are thoughtful and do want to talk. So we select on attitude, as is being talked about. We select, do you have the attitude? Do you have the virtues to be able to talk across difference? We select on that criteria in part. We also select on people who we think have something to say. Not everyone has, they haven't thought about it. They just accept one narrative, like, obviously affirming is just what you do. Like, obvious, because, society says it's good to have gay liberation. So we just do that. We select people who have been more thoughtful, for example, on side A. Yeah, we select people who generate insight in that regard, like new insight for the listeners, for our conversations. I would say those are my key principles. David, Frank, do you have others?
Just echoing what you're saying around trying to find people who can add some theological articulation. And we want, we engage people's stories, and we know that all of our theology is developed in kind of narrative format. And we just want to be able to, have clear discussion on this. It is very difficult when what words people use can mean just very different things. And so sometimes even just an hour-long podcast doesn't allow us to get as far as we'd like to in a conversation to really tease out some of the differences that we've come across. And in a lot of ways, because in the American context, side B is kind of a minority of minorities. It's an unwanted step sibling by everybody. That if they're willing to engage with us, it already says something about them.
I will also add. May I add one more thing? And I think this is relevant to the question, but it's just started. I'm really invested in platforming more views that are not from European Americans, and that has included Africans, especially because I've lived in Africa since my youth. So it's part of me. It's part of my life. So I have African side A Africans. They're hard to find, but I have some friends, and I'm trying to get them on, for example. But it's been difficult just because of their schedules, and being out in public causes people damage a reputation, makes their life harder.
Yes.
But so there's all these complexities. So a lot of people we have talked with are from the U.S., but there's been another goal to get more people who are not from the U.S. to speak. And because these questions and experiences are not only be handled in the U.S., even if the U.S. has a loud voice because of it's an empire, like it's powerful. But these conversations are happening throughout the world. So we should platform it as much as we can, is my my goal and our goal.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Please continue, my friend.
Sorry, I just had one question I wanted to ask, because what do you do when you receive requests for dialogue from people who you know could be, I don't know, quite aggressive in terms of their, if you think of, for example, like American cultural warriors or social Christian apologists who would dialogue for the sake of winning arguments, would you accept that, or under certain conditions, or I don't know, have you received those kind of offers before, or because I do all the time, so.
Can you clarify their requests? Are they trying to come to an event you're hosting, or is it just what's the context of the dialogue?
Oh, well, it depends. But like, for example, some people would want me to debate them on a YouTube show, for example, or
Yeah.
that kind of context, or other contexts when they would want to have like a discussion group or something. But when you know their attitude beforehand,
Yeah, completely understand. We're just having this conversation amongst another group of friends that he was asking the same question around, like, I don't know if I want to do another debate. I would really like to have a conversation where we can share, and this tension of like, well, there are actually so few opportunities, especially with it being like, oh, it's either the really progressive or the really conservative view that are getting these loud voices that we know people are watching, that'd be like, well, it would be nice to have more side B voices on YouTube that pop up when you type in gay and Christian.
Right.
And so when to take those opportunities to, say, well, I know that they're not going to, like, it's not the exact type of conversation. And when either are there opportunities to completely flip the script and saying, hey, can we just have a dialogue that's not a debate style? Or I'm always interested in creative tweaking of, before the debate, can we first answer the question of why this conversation really hits home for us? And are there things we can do that's not just, to on switch, off switch of like debate or no debate, but we can say, I want to engage it if we're able to, I want to make sure this is humanized or something, and I want to build friendship with this person. If you think you're literally just going to get like yelled at, then, you can be like, sorry, I don't expect to be respected. So, there's a virtue of justice, as TJ said.
I think it can be good though to set how you organize the time. You say like, you have a voice, then I have a voice, then you can respond, I can respond. I've had good experiences with that, but they still have to be willing to respect that. If they don't respect that at all, then it's hard. But yeah.
Totally true. Yeah. If they are a more energetic personality, like a certain president in the U.S. that literally had to get his just microphone turned off in order to reasonably participate in the debate.
Also, I would say Americans are less polite than a lot of other people. Like they'll just sometimes talk and they'll just keep talking. So you have to balance those things. Yeah. Yeah. So Americans are polite, just to be clear, but just less polite than other people. Is there any way, if any of our listeners want to follow you or connect to your work, is there any website or social media or something that you could share with us?
So yeah, I have an Instagram account. I do try to post things that are encouraging, generally speaking, on that, so people can find me there. There's also, so I'm part of a Bible study for queer people. So if you're interested in that ministry, or if you're traveling to Japan, you're queer, and you'd love to be part of a group of queer people reading scripture together and sharing prayer requests and praying for one another, if you'd be interested in something like that, you can also find the Instagram account for that ministry.
For me, I think most of my tweets and everything are in Japanese. But there is a website for the dialogue group that I'm part of called Dream Party, the most weirdest name. But so yeah, maybe I can put a link to that. But that's in Japanese too. But it has like different resources as well.
Sounds good. Yeah, thank you.
So
so
maybe-
much.
Great. We'll include
Yeah.
those in the show notes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. Thank you, listeners, for joining us for this really delightful conversation. To Aogu, I say, because it's so late, oyasumi nasai. To
ありがとうござい
Kaz
ます。
To Kaz, I say sayonara.
ありがとうございます。さよなら。
ありがとうございます。
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Hey, thank you for joining for another episode of New Kinship. We would always appreciate any feedback. Feel free to reach out to us. You can find us on Instagram. We publish our episodes as well as some writings on Substack. But we're also on all your favorite podcast apps.